In 2001, at the ripe old age of 38, I shared an idea with my wife. I wanted to ride my bicycle across the United States solo. No one following me, no support van to carry supplies, food, or spare parts. Just me, my bicycle, and God. That was it. Now, before we get started, I have to say something about my wife, Karen. Karen is a special person. To have put up with a person that wakes up every morning in a new world for 23 years is a feat in itself. But to have supported me in this wild trip that I had planned is something that I'll never forget. Not only once, but 3 times. The film footage you're going to see is a combination of those 3 trips, 2001, 2002, and 2003. I trained for about 3 months to get ready for this ride. Every morning before work and every afternoon I would ride up and down mountains and ridges. My goal was to be able to ride 100 miles every day. After 3 months of training, a bunch of sit-ups, and hundreds of miles of climbing, I was ready. I had my bicycle shipped to a motel in San Diego, California, then purchased an airline ticket and was ready to go. Once I boarded the airplane in Huntsville, Alabama, I pulled out the journal my wife Karen had suggested I carry along and began to write. Journal entry. We're not even airborne yet, and already I miss my wife and my family. When I left the airport, Kayla, my youngest and most independent girl, was laughing hysterically. I knew she was only doing that to keep from crying. Leanne, my oldest daughter, and Karen turned their backs as I walked down the jetway. I know they were crying and didn't want me to see. I don't know what this trip holds for me. It's all a huge mystery. I really can't think about it now, though. All I'm thinking of is my family. Just before I planned this trip, I had rededicated my life to Christ. I guess in some ways this trip was a thank you to God for being so forgiving. I had signs made and placed on my bicycle that had a red cross and the word Cycling for Christ. The thought was that perhaps when people noticed a scrawny little southern boy pedaling down the roadway, they would see the sign and think about Christ. Maybe it would help someone discover a part of themselves that seemed lost to them. There are lots of things I'm going to be talking about during this trip, and maybe I ought to explain a few of them. The first one is a cycling computer. You see, I used a cycling computer that tracks speed, average speed, distance, time ridden, and cadence. Really, a cycling computer is nothing more than a glorified speedometer. Now, the cadence that I mentioned is how fast you spin the pedals. The pedals that I used were clipless pedals. Clipless pedals have a locking device in them that allows you to lock your foot into the pedal. That way, every time you push on the pedal, there's no movement between your foot and the pedal itself, so you don't lose any energy. I carried all my supplies in pannier bags. Panniers are really saddle bags that you hang on a rack over your rear wheel. Now, when I packed these things, I put 60 pounds of weight in it, and that's how I would train. On the trip, most of the weight would be water. I carried very little spare parts and supplies because really what you needed was more water and food. There are a lot of towns out west that are like 100 miles apart with nothing in between. So you had to be sure before you left for a day's ride to pack plenty of water and plenty of food. I also used Presta valves in my tubes. Presta valves really allow you to be able to inflate your tire with a CO2 cartridge like you would shoot a BB gun with. You just put it in this little adapter, stick it over your inner tube, and pull the handle, and psh, your tire's full. Journal entry. Although the flight has been uneventful, I'm having huge concerns about my ability to do this trip. Looking out the window, I see deserts and mountains with virtually no civilization. Some of the towns are over 100 miles apart. Maybe I've packed too many supplies. 60-pound panniers on a bicycle while climbing a mountain may be more than I can do. What if my bicycle breaks down in the desert? Maybe I've made a big mistake by coming here. I know this is going to be a huge physical challenge, but mentally it's gigantic. Fear is a disease that can eat you alive, and at this point, it's consuming me. Karen, always the one who thinks ahead, had placed a small Bible in my pack, so I pulled it out and began to read. Wow, what faith the disciples must have had. They left their families, homes, and friends and set off on a journey through the deserts and mountains of the Middle East. At least I have a bicycle, maps, and a roadway to travel. About all these guys had was a goat skin filled with water, maybe a little bread, and their faith. Faith. I never really had that much faith. Of course I believe in God, but am I really willing to put my life in jeopardy? Well, soon enough I landed in San Diego and caught a shuttle bus to the hotel. A week earlier I had taken my bike apart, packed it up, and sent it ahead. Now from my room I unpacked it and began to reassemble it. As I lay all the parts out, I noticed something terribly wrong. The front axle had been damaged during shipping and was useless. Oddly enough, maybe at the behest of Karen, I had packed a spare axle, so I quickly located it and soon had my bike ready to go. Wow, what are the odds that I would have packed a spare axle? As my old flight instructor used to say, God watches out over fools and idiots.
Don't go anywhere. Southern Folks and Southern Places will be right back.
This program is brought to you by Cooper Hosiery.
We're back with more of Southern Folks and Southern Places.
San Diego is close to the Mexican border, so before I left out, I took a tram ride down to the border to check it out. You folks might like to take a trip to Tijuana, but as for this old southern boy, I didn't see anywhere that they sold pintos, mashed taters, and cornbread, so needless to say, I didn't stay there long. Oh yeah, and by the way, don't ask for sweet tea out west. They'll think you're crazy. The sun was shining, my bike was assembled, and it was time to go, but before I could leave, I had to repeat an old custom. Anyone who's cycling from one ocean to another must dip his rear wheel in the ocean before he departs and his front wheel when he is finished. I wasn't sure about dipping in the Atlantic, but at least I had made it to the Pacific, so I dipped away.
We're having to climb hills like that all day long.
Leaving San Diego, I enjoyed a few downhills, but for the most part, it was a continual climb. In the east, we might refer to these as mountains, but out west, they just call them hills. My first day, I was headed for the small town of Boulevard, California. It was an 80-mile ride through some of the steepest hills I've ever climbed. The biggest problem this day was not the mild 80-degree temperature, but leg cramps. I probably walked 20 of the 80 miles just trying to walk out cramps. That night at the motel, I called my wife Karen and talked to her about taking a bus across the desert. I was afraid and wanted to give in. I knew the next day was going to be bad, but Karen, being the good person she is, only gave me words of encouragement. The next day, after a lot of praying, I woke up with a new burst of energy. I was still apprehensive about crossing the desert, but I was ready to give it a try. I was headed for Brawley, California, just north of the border town of El Centro. But before I re-entered civilization, I would face 100-degree temperatures in the barren Yuha Desert. Still, though, I had a few miles of cool, high desert left to ride, and I was intent to enjoy it. There really wasn't a lot to look at, though. The only town, or actually just a settlement, was Jacumba. No stores, no shopping centers, just a couple of old dilapidated houses was all that stood there. About the only action I saw was a Border Patrol vehicle watching over our borders.
This is the border of the United States. He's patrolling it.
Looking at the landscape, I couldn't believe that people would cross such inhospitable terrain. But even out here in the middle of nowhere, if you look closely, you can see hundreds of footprints in the sand that could only have been made by people crossing the border. Leaving the high desert behind, I enjoyed a 27-mile coast off a 66% grade at the Oco Pass. Down below loomed the desert, but I had packed plenty of water and lots of fruit and was ready for it. Another thing that I found to be invaluable was sunscreen. I used the highest SPF you could find, but at the end of the day, I would still find burns that had formed water blisters on the back of my legs, arms, and even my ears. The do-rag I'm wearing may look like I'm trying to be cool, and actually, you're exactly right. I would soak this rag in water and then tie it on my head to help fight the heat. Hey, I ain't got much in the way of brains, so I had to do all I could to protect them. In El Centro, I stopped to get a cool drink. It was the first store I'd seen in over 60 miles, and I was not about to pass it up. Just as I was about to leave for Brawley, I noticed a big lanky kid come flying in the parking lot on a bicycle. From the look of his bike, he was also on a cross country, and from the look of him, he was suffering from heat exhaustion. We began to talk and found out that we were both headed for Georgia. I asked if he wanted to rest for a little bit, so we found a restaurant to sit down in and had a hot meal. Ibrahim El-Awadi, or Hema as I called him, was born in Indiana. His dad was Egyptian and his mom American. Hema was only 17 years old, was alone, and in the beginning stages of heat exhaustion. I was concerned about his well-being if he continued this trip alone. He asked if he could follow along with me for a few days, and like any good Southerner, I couldn't refuse. 20 miles later, we found a room in a flea bag establishment in Brawley, California, and Hema soaked in their pool while I phoned home to Karen. Early the next morning, we had to cross the Imperial Valley and the Sand Dunes Recreational Area. Don't confuse this with a lush national park. This is not a place to be in the middle of the day. The temperatures get hot enough here to melt the asphalt. We crossed the Imperial Valley at 11 a.m. and rode into Palo Verde. Just to show you that miracles do happen, while we were riding across the Imperial Valley, Hema ran out of water. Now, there was nowhere to get water until you reached Palo Verde, which was 30 miles away at that point. It was 114 degrees, and I was drinking like a racehorse. I had one extra bottle of water, so I gave it to Hema. Just as we were about to run totally out, we came upon a border checking station. It was supposed to be closed, but lo and behold, someone was there who had a freezer full of ice. Later that day, another group of cyclists were not so fortunate. They were stranded in about the same place without water, and one of the riders succumbed to the intense heat and passed out. Finally, a passerby spotted them in the middle of the desert, picked them up, brought them into Palo Verde, where one of them received medical attention.